Let's talk about this term under the law. What does that mean? Under the law. If you corroborate this back to Romans chapter 6, Paul is defining something very similar to what he's been defining in Galatia here. But in Romans chapter 6, I'm just going to begin in verse 12. I'm going to read that text. Romans 6, Paul says this, "Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lusts. And do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God." In other words, walk in the Spirit is what he's saying, and he's given an illustration of baptism and what it represents. But then verse 14 says this, "For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." Anybody ever had this term thrown out to them, to their Christian friend, when you told them that you're practicing Messianic Judaism and you're celebrating Shabbat or maybe keeping kosher? Anybody ever tell you, well, hey, man, you don't really need to be doing that because you're not under law, you're under grace? Maybe you've had that experience. And here I think Paul's point in Romans is the term under the Torah means under the Torah's condemnation. Means that its definition of sin has got you condemned and you are under the Torah. And Paul's saying, look, we've been saved and we should live and match according to the way that our confession is. But does that always represent what under the law means? Well, here in Galatians, Paul says that Messiah was born under the law. Does that mean under sin there? No. It actually, in that context, it means somebody who's probably been circumcised, somebody who's come into, again, this term under the law or coming into faith under the law was oftentimes an allusion to somebody who had converted to Judaism or somebody who had took on circumcision. And so the term under the law in that context means somebody who's Jewish or somebody who's converted. What's my point? It depends on the context as to what it means. Paul uses it different ways. And I've heard people in Messianic Jewish practice oftentimes get kind of hung up on this term of under the law. And no, it always means this. Well, it doesn't always mean that. It depends on the context. But the big issue is understanding that the Besorah, the gospel, is for all. No status faction. You see, these Galatians had a faction amongst themselves, and we're going to see that Paul continues to flesh this out as we get into chapters 5 and chapter 6, that it was causing all kinds of hatred and bitterness amongst them as a people group because of their difference of understanding of status. And we need to ask ourselves the question, is our sole priority to take on a Jewish identity? And I would open it up to any other issue of status. Maybe it has to do with marriage and singleness. Or maybe it has to do with making a certain amount of income. Or maybe it has to do with being in a certain position within the congregation. Or maybe it has to do with being in a certain position or having a certain responsibility at your work. We tend to define ourselves based upon how others see us. And we need to understand that when it comes to God's grace and His salvation, He has graciously given that to all. Griffin Schroeder, Amy and Larry's son, he asked me a question a couple of months ago when we were back in Genesis that oftentimes comes up when we read the Torah portion, Vayechi, that has to do with the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh. And he asked the question, and maybe you've heard this question before, why do we bless our sons with the blessing that may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh? I mean, why that blessing? Why not God make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Wouldn't that be a better blessing? I mean, in a way, yes, right? And I never really thought about this, but I think if it was, he talks about it in their teaching as well. The blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh is the blessing of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what's unique about them? What kind of mother did they have? Asnath is a Gentile, right? Which, now, we don't know if she converted or not, but they were not naturalized citizens in a sense with the other sons of Jacob. And what does Jacob do? He adopts them. He adopts them. In fact, one could argue, and this is the point that Paul's making about adoption here, one could argue that in a sense there's a greatness to adoption that goes even beyond that of a natural-born child. Because a natural-born child had no choice whether or not they were in the family. It's simply what came about from their parents. But a child who's been adopted, this person sought that child out and said, I want you.